Hello, my name is Rachael Naismith, and I'm a librarian at Springfield College. I'm also the great-granddaughter of the inventor of basketball, James Naismith. My dad was James Naismith's grandson, and to my father, James Naismith was simply Grandpa. The family called him Papa Jimmy, and he loved his grandchildren a lot. They spent a lot of time just cuddling, and my father remembered his bearded cheek rubbing up against him. They spent a lot of times outdoors. James Naismith loved to be outside. They'd spend the whole day fishing and spending the day in the sunlight. And his grandchildren really adored him and didn't think of him as the inventor of the game of basketball, a sport that was being played all over the world, because within weeks of its invention, it really was being played all over the world thanks to the YMCA. What I'd like to talk to you about is my feelings about my great-grandfather, what I think is really significant about his life, and also tell you 3 stories that you might not have heard. James Naismith, in my mind, embodied what Springfield College calls the humanics philosophy. This is the philosophy that each individual should develop his or her spirit, mind, and body equally, and also develop themselves as a leader in service to others. I feel that James Naismith, who was a very simple and humble man, spent his life trying to do that, to really follow the humanics philosophy. The first story I want to tell you about him had to do with his work as a student at McGill University, where he was in the seminary. He was studying to become a minister up in Canada. And he was very religious and following Christian studies, but he was also extremely interested in sports. He played every sport he could. He played lacrosse, he played football, and it was in fact playing football that he ended up hurting his ear. And it was so badly hurt that he developed a certain kind of a headgear or hat to protect his ear. And some people credit him with inventing the first football helmet. Now, one night he was in his dorm room and he was studying, and a group of his friends came and they confronted him. And they said, "Jim, it is really inappropriate for someone who's going to become a minister, who's studying in the seminary, to be out playing sports the way you are in all kinds of weather. It's not fitting. You need to make a choice. Either you will be a minister or you're going to be playing sports." James Naismith did not want to make that choice. And it was around this time that he heard about a new college that was being formed in Massachusetts, the Young Men's Christian Association Training School in Springfield. And he decided that he wanted to look into going to this school, which stressed Christianity as well as physical education. So for him, it was really a perfect fit. On his application to the college, he wrote, "My life work is to do good to men and serve God. And wherever I can do this best, there I want to go." As you know, he was accepted. I'm not going to tell you the story of the invention of the game of basketball, which has been written so many places and been told so many times. What I do want to talk to you about is how my great-grandfather felt about race and gender as it relates to sports. This was a time when sports were mostly being played by white males. James Naismith encouraged women and African Americans to participate in sports and to be viewed as respected athletes. In fact, it was very shortly after basketball games began to be played at the YMCA training school, which did become Springfield College, that a group of women teachers from the Springfield area approached him and said, "Is there any reason why women couldn't be playing this game?" And he responded, "I don't see why not." So very shortly after that, there was the first women's team playing basketball. And some of them were the same teachers who had approached him, one of whom was named Maud Sherman, who later he went on to marry. She was my great-grandmother. I want to also tell you a story that relates to race. And this has to do with a man you may have heard of named John McClendon. John McClendon was a young African American who in the 1930s applied to the University of Kansas, which was a segregated university at the time. This was where James Naismith ended up spending most of his career teaching and coaching. And the reason that John McClendon wanted to go there was because of my great-grandfather. He met my great-grandfather, and James Naismith became his mentor and friend. Now, at the University of Kansas at the time, if you were going to major in physical education, the way John McClendon was, you had to learn to swim. So John McClendon would go to the swimming pool every morning and practice his swimming. And he noticed that after he would swim in the pool, the custodial staff would drain the pool. And one morning he said, "Are you draining the pool because I swam in it?" And the response was, "Use your own judgment." So he was talking to his mentor, James Naismith, and he mentioned this. And so James Naismith took a few of his biggest, strongest football players and sent them to the swimming pool, where they sat around the pool every single morning when John McClendon swam his laps to protect him and gave him support. The other thing that happened around this time was that signs started to appear on campus saying, "Don't swim with the N-word." So at this point, James Naismith finally went to the president of the University of Kansas and said, "If these signs don't come down and this harassment doesn't stop, I will resign." Well, they didn't want to lose James Naismith, so the signs came down and the situation was quickly resolved. John McClendon went on to a great career as a coach. The famous Julius Erving, Dr. J, called him the father of black basketball, and he was the first African American coach inducted into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. The final story I want to tell you has to do with my great-grandfather needing money. James Naismith never had much money. None of the Naismiths ever had a whole lot of money. And some of his friends said to him, "Why don't you patent this sport so that you can become rich off the sport of basketball?" And his response was, "I don't want to patent it. I don't need to become rich." His attitude was that money was the source of all evil. He said, "I would like to give this sport to the world as a gift." Again, this reminds me of the humanics philosophy. So he was then told that basketball was going to be played for the first time in the Olympics, and this was the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, which was made famous because it was presided over by Adolf Hitler, and it was also made famous because of the great African-American athlete Jesse Owens. James Naismith was invited to attend so that they could honor him as the inventor of this sport, but he didn't have enough money to attend. So his friends and colleagues found out that this was the case, and they came up with a really innovative idea. They invented something called Naismith Nights. And for months before the Olympics, at basketball games all over the country, at very tiny basketball games in local gymnasiums and at great big basketball games, they collected pennies. And these pennies were sent to the University of Kansas and collected. And there were finally enough so that, in fact, James Naismith was able to go to Berlin to be honored at the ceremonies for the invention of basketball. And this was at the age of 78, 3 years before his death. That's the end of my stories. And I just wanted to say that a lot of stories about James Naismith are told by the family members, and a lot of other ones are written down. There are mementos and items and books about James Naismith. Many are at the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. Some are at Springfield College Archives. Others are in Almont, Canada, at a foundation. That's the town where he was born. And I love to read these stories. I love to look at these mementos. I feel very fortunate to be a librarian. I'm in a field that helps to collect and to share knowledge. And I also feel very fortunate to be at the college where James Naismith spent the years for which he's best known. The years where he invented this sport, where he spent that last night of his assignment to come up with a new sport, tossing and turning, only to wake up in the morning knowing that he had found the sport that he'd been looking for. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you about my great-grandfather, James Naismith.